Okay, there we go. Okay, so a few things to note about the Sermon on the Plain is we kind of need to talk about the differences between Sermon on the Plain and Sermon on the Mount. And those differences are rooted in the differences between the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. So if you really look at these two books, they have a different focus. And for me, when I reconcile the differences that I see in the Gospels, you can imagine, right? Jesus, his ministry was very full. He was always preaching, always talking to groups of people. He literally spent 365 days a year for 3 years, surrounded by people, giving countless sermons. And for me, when I see the two differences, I understand that there were two followers that were close to Jesus that took all of these experiences. And really, when they wrote down these gospels, they had particular things that they want to focus on. And for me, I think it's more than likely that, if you are Luke and you really want to focus on Jesus confronting evil, right? And the different times in his ministry that you witness where he really went face to face with evil, you're going to write about that and you're going to focus on that. And, for Luke, let's say he really focuses on, and you really saw how Jesus interacted and really spoke into people's social situations and social status and economic status, then you're going to take that away. Versus someone like Matthew, who really saw, as he was following Jesus and as he was following Jesus' ministry over 3 years, how Jesus was really the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. And when Matthew writes down his gospel, he wants any Jewish person to read it, for them to, at the end of that book, believe that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. So these are two different accounts. Both of them are examining the same person. They were closely with Jesus for 3 years as he was doing his ministry. But because you have a certain intent, when you sit down and write this book and you have a certain focus, you're going to focus on certain sermons, certain experiences. So if you look at the book of Luke, and this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, but you see how Luke focuses on how Jesus is connected to all of humanity. So if you look at the genealogy in the beginning of Luke, it starts from Adam, right? Versus in Matthew, it starts from Abraham. Right. And that's the two differences. Luke wants to say that Jesus is the savior for all of humanity. Matthew wants to say to the Jewish reader, Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. So, a lot of people get hung up at the fact that there's 4 gospels and they seem to take one sermon and they seem to be 2 different things. How can one sermon be 2 different things? Well, for me, the way I understand it is if you are following somebody for 3 years and you have a certain intent and a certain outlook, right? You're going to see certain things and then you're going to compile it and the finished work is going to be different. And another thing, I really believe that, all throughout the Gospels, Jesus is speaking constantly, right? I think a lot of times people think, like for the sermon that we're going to look at, the Sermon on the Mount versus the Sermon on the Plain, people think that, this is one sermon and they were recorded differently. But if Jesus has spoke so many times to so many different kinds of people, he could have given the same sermon, but the same kind of core message, but given it to a certain crowd one way and given it to another crowd another way. So that's the way I kind of understand it. So there are these kind of comparisons between the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And like I said, one is more focused on Jesus, how Jesus connects to all of humanity, Jesus versus evil, and Jesus and looking at people's social situation. Matthew is looking at people's inner life, inner spiritual life and hearts. And he is very critical of, like in Luke is very critical of the wealthy and very critical of people who abuse their power. Matthew is very critical of the religious leaders because Matthew is more focused on people's spiritual state and also that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. So those are the two differences. Now, when we look at the Sermon on the Plain, you see those differences come out. And we'll kind of have a side-by-side look. So the Sermon on the Mount is very famous. It's probably, one of the most famous passages in the Bible. And it really seems to sum up Jesus's heart and who Jesus is to the world. And that's true. But Luke, it's a very similar sermon, but Luke is focusing on people's economic status and people's current situation. So you could really see this in the beginning of the sermon when it starts out in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. It starts off, blessed are the poor in spirit. And in the book of Luke, it's blessed are the poor, period. And you see this later on. Blessed are I forgot what it is exactly. We'll see it in the text by text comparison. Another difference is in the book of Matthew, there are no woes. The woes come very later on in the book of Matthew, where he is looking at where Jesus is talking to the religious leaders, and he says, woe to you, for you fill the average person with so many burdens. Woe to you for the burden that you put on the regular person. But in the book of Luke, the woes are right in the sermon. Woe to you who are rich now, for you will suffer later on. So it's the woes are right there, right side by side, and there's a clear contrast between what Jesus is saying between the Sermon on the Plain with those who are blessed and those that Jesus is saying woe to. There's this contrast between the two groups. So you see it here. Blessed. So this is the Matthew one, and this is the Luke one. Oh, okay. This is what I was thinking of. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are you who are hungry, for you are filled. Right? This is talking about a spiritual hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Right? That's a spiritual thing that on the inside. This desire to see righteousness, a desire to live rightly with God in the world, but not having that desire fulfilled, versus, Luke's focus in saying, blessed are you who are hungry. That's your physical state. Has to do with your social standing. So those are the two. That's another clear difference. So, and obviously the blessings for the Beatitudes are much longer here, versus in Luke, it's very short. And it's very into people's current situation, poor, those who are hungry, those who are hurting, those who weep. And then blessed are you who, when people say evil against you, people say evil words, right? So there's that. And that correlates with verse 11 down here. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil. So the woes here, they don't come in the book of Matthew till much later. So you see there's this very distinct contrast, blessing and the woes. And I think one of the reasons why Sermon on the Mount is a lot more famous is because it's much easier to preach on the Sermon on the Mount than it is preaching on the Sermon on the Plain. The Sermon on the Plain, I think this is a very hard passage for any pastor to preach on. That's just my two takes. Because what does that mean? Is Jesus saying money in and of itself is wrong? To be rich is wrong? That's what it sounds like he's saying, based on the passage. And, if you happen to be rich, whereas, in Hawaii, right, most people that you talk to, even if you're just in the middle class, compared to the rest of the world, you are rich, right? Woe to you are rich, for you have received your consolation. And it's this idea that just being rich in and of itself is something that Jesus doesn't want. So that, I mean, I think on first glance, it's a very hard passage to preach on. But one thing we really have to look at, the book of Luke as a whole. And, in the beginning of Luke, in Luke chapter 3, like we said, he talks about who was ruling at the time. So he talks about the structure of the world. So you kind of open up seeing, in the time of Emperor Tiberius, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, right? And there was all the different rulers listed. One of them was King Herod, Pontius Pilate, and the high priest Caiaphas. These are all people very much recorded in history, right? It's not just the Bible that's recording these people. These are people that their lives have been very well recorded, pretty well recorded. So we know that they existed. We know pretty much what their reign was like and how they lived. And they really, in a lot of ways, abused their power. For Emperor Tiberius, he was crazy. I don't know. There's no other word to say it, right? But if you learn about him, he's really not all there. He was very evil, very heartless. The same pool as maybe Stalin and Hitler. Like he did some good things, right, in the Roman Empire, but he was mostly a very evil person. And then you have King Herod, as we know, he was very thirsty for power, and he really just really wanted to keep his power. And you have Pontius Pilate, who wasn't willing to stand up, whether or not Jesus did anything wrong. He handed him over, right? And we see that he is also not a really great person. And then you have the high priest Caiaphas, who was overseeing the temple and the working of the temple, and was also trying to keep his power. He was a Sadducee, trying to hold his power, and kind of ease the tensions between the Jewish people and the Roman government, because they wanted to hold their power. And, if you look later on at the way the temple was run, it was really so that the rich were benefiting off the temple and the poor were suffering because of it. So this is the structure of the world. So when Jesus is speaking, he goes to the sermon, he's speaking on a plain, on a level ground, and he starts this message. He's saying, woe to you, blessed are you who are poor, right? And he's really talking to the people there, and he's also talking about the world, right? He's talking about the system of the world. And I think that's really important, right? I think, there's two things that he's talking about. He's looking at the structure of the world, where you have those that are very powerful benefiting from many, right? So you have that system. And you also have a system where people believed, and this is the world that Jesus was speaking to, people really believed that wealth in and of itself was a sign of God's blessing, right? It was a sign of God being on your side. And being poor in and of itself was a sign that God was unhappy with you, right? So you have this social structure that, is corrupt, and you just have a few people that are rich and wealthy and comfortable. And you have masses and masses of people who are barely able to live, barely scraping by, just barely able to survive. And what Jesus is saying when he says his blessings and his woes, he's saying that because he has come, his message, who he is saying, your economic status has no bearing on whether or not you find favor with God. Being poor in and of itself doesn't mean that God condemns you. As a matter of fact, now that Christ has come, if you're poor, you would have a better idea of who God is versus those who are rich. If you are rich in this world, because it was very hard to be rich without getting that wealth from exploiting others, your judgment will come, your time will come, because you're not going to be a part of what God's doing. And this is really true when we see what happens with the disciples, right? When we see the followers of Jesus, they are really able to see the world change around them. They're able to see Jesus, who is the Son of God, but going to the poor, going to the lame, going to those that are hungry, those that can't, speak for themselves or do anything, people who have no power in their life. He's going to them and helping them and meeting them where they are, versus those with wealth and those with power, especially the religious leaders. They are not going to be a part of that. They are not really going to understand that. And if anything, they get the rebuke from Jesus. So I believe that's what Jesus is saying, in this sermon. Oops. Okay. So there's one thing I wanted to talk about. Okay, so this is, I think this you guys know who this is, right? Jim and Tammy Baker. I think, this kind of, this idea that wealth is a sign from God, that God has blessed you. I think that kind of theology is very pervasive in the Christian faith. And I think every generation has a version of this type of gospel, this prosperity gospel. So, back in the 80s, it was 70s and 80s, it was Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, right? And growing up, I found this story fascinating because by the time I was growing up, I think Jim Baker was like in prison already. Like it had already blown up. So as I became a Christian and I was like growing up in my faith, and I found the aftermath of this whole story fascinating, kind of in the way where you watch something and you can't believe you're watching it, but you can't stop. It's one of those situations. But I read, like, I think he wrote a few books about his experience. I think I read all those books when I was in high school because I just wanted to see, how does someone end up becoming like this? How does somebody do something like this? And basically, in one of the books that he wrote a book called I'm Sorry. And he kind of wrote like just his experience, right? And I read a couple books about this whole thing, right? This whole mess with PTL Ministries and all of that stuff. But I thought it was very interesting how, you had people who were educated and, very well-meaning. You had thousands of people, like some people sold their homes. They poured their like life savings and, every ounce of like their savings and money. And, there were some stories of people putting like their college funds and, because every week he would go on his show and say something, right? Like, he had to raise money, right, for PTL Ministries. And, they had an amusement park and a theme park and, so many things going on. And you had people like just giving everything to this person, to like this television personality. And I just thought, growing up, that this whole story was very fascinating. And, I remember reading about it a lot when I was in high school. And also his son ended up becoming a pastor too. And I read his books too. But he was kind of maybe more like on the fringe, very burned by the church. But, so he had a very interesting experience and a very interesting perspective. But what I think is interesting is now when I look at the current version of the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, I feel like it's just as prevalent, but it just looks differently. And so there's this Instagram account called Preachers and Sneakers. And basically, it's just an Instagram account of, it just takes, so I will actually share my desktop. It just takes people's, I'm going to stop share for a second. I'm going to pull it up. So it just takes, different pastors and their clothing and their shoes, and he puts up like how much they cost, right? So some of like the really, really popular pastors nowadays. So one of them is Stephen Furtick, right? It's a very, very charismatic, very popular preacher. But this Instagram account is dedicated to preachers and their sneakers, right? So how much they spend on their sneakers, right? So, and granted, sneakers that now are just really popular. Like that's just the new thing. Everybody is wearing like really, really expensive sneakers. Like that's something that people do nowadays. But you have like all of these really popular now, charismatic, evangelical preachers, and every week when they come to church, they are wearing, yeah, like ripped up jeans and sneakers, but those sneakers are sometimes like thousands of dollars, or they're wearing like like a belt that costs like a couple $1,000s, and a lot of times when you listen to their messages, and a lot of times when you listen to what they are espousing. So I'll just kind of go through some of these, right? $4,000 Air Jordan. So you see like the picture of what they're wearing. And really this idea of, wealth as being indicative of God's blessing, and all these things, like that's still very prevalent, especially in the younger generation today. I think a lot of the evangelical young charismatic movements, there are a lot of pastors that really believe that because God has blessed you, you're serving God, it's okay you know to live this like very lavish lifestyle and to kind of flaunt this lavish lifestyle. And these are not like on the fringe, like these crazy like televangelists that come on the TV. These are very popular, very well known young evangelical pastors that like some of them hang out with Justin Bieber and like pop idols and things like that. So I think it's important to recognize that this idea or this belief that God is could use wealth, right? And for someone to say, wealth in and of itself is a blessing from God, and poverty in and of itself is something, that is a sign of what God thinks about you. I think that's something that we need to recognize as clearly wrong. And I think we need to also look at, whenever we hear something like that, we really need to look at Luke chapter 6. And I think oftentimes people don't read Luke chapter 6, because it is one of their, especially if you are, speaking in a church like the churches that a lot of these wealthy preachers are preaching at, right? They want to hear, no, God has blessed you. The more you give, the more God will bless you, and if you give a little bit, God will give back tenfold. And that's the line. And Jim Baker used that line every week, saying if you give $1,000, that'll be guaranteed $10,000, a couple of years. And it's just this same idea. We really need to look at Luke chapter 6 and what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, no, that's not how the kingdom of God works. The kingdom of God works outside that realm. That's really the point of, I think, that sermon. Okay, so second part. Okay. So from the next part, so this was last Sunday's message. This is also another very hard passage to talk about and think about. And really, Jesus goes from talking about the structure of the world and kind of condemning the way the world looks to addressing the people that are in front of him. And we know that because in verse 27, it says, "But I say to you that listen." So this is now a transition. And it's very clear in the original language that he means everybody to shift their focus. And he's really talking about the way they interact with each other. And I think like there's a lot in the Matthew version, for example, people think that he's talking a lot about like how Jews interact with Romans and things like that. I think there's an argument for that, but I definitely think in Luke chapter 6, he's talking about the way they interact with each other. And again, that's really important because it's talking about an even power dynamic. He's talking about, you guys, the world is like this, you guys act like this to each other. And we need to say that because you don't ever want to think that if someone is being perpetually abused and victimized, to pull out this verse and say, but turn the other cheek, give your shirt also. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, let's you guys, the way you interact with each other, let's live differently than the rest of the world. So somebody can retaliate if they wanted to. So then I think he presents what I really think is a radical love ethic, and he starts off by giving kind of general commands: love your enemies, respond to those who hate you with good deeds, speak well of those who curse you. Or he says, like in the passage, it says, bless those who curse you. But the word bless actually doesn't mean the same blessed as we heard earlier in this passage. The word bless means to speak well of. So speak well of those who curse you, pray for those who wrong you. So these are very general statements. So you don't really quite know what he's talking about until he gives these two specific examples. And then it becomes clear what he means. And in verse 29, it says, if anyone strikes you on your cheek, offer the other. And this is, in this world, it was very strange. And anyone witnessing something like this would find it very strange. But what I think is there's a lot of genius in the way Jesus goes about explaining this. So, for example, if you were to witness somebody smacking another person, you would immediately look at the person being smacked and think, what did they do that they're getting smacked, right? And the person smacking might seem like a righteous person, right? Because he's being wronged and now standing up for himself. But if the person being smacked now turns the other cheek, it's clear, it almost seems like it's clear that it's not actually this person that did wrong. This person is being wronged. And this person, the person smacking the person, is being violent. And what I think really happens is when somebody, I think Jesus is showing a way where we could stop the cycle of violence and also to expose what violence is in and of itself. So if somebody turns the other cheek, the person perpetuating that violence has to think and is in the position to have to wonder if they need to smack you a second time, right? And if they choose not to smack you a second time, then why did they resort to such violence in the first place? So I think it really exposes violence. Same thing when, somebody takes another person's, somebody takes someone's cloak, right? Offer your shirt. Well, if you offer that person's, if the person offers a shirt, then that could be dangerous because it could be really cold, in the desert, right? That person could die from not wearing a shirt. So the person would have to think, no, but I don't want to, I don't want to do that to you. I don't want to put you in that situation where you don't have a shirt. Well, if you are even thinking that about what the lack of shirt is going to do to that person, why did you take their cloak? Right? So I think it's forcing the person doing the wrong and perpetuating the violence to think about what they're doing. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. And I think Jesus is really saying, let's end the cycle of violence. Let's end the cycle. But the ending that cycle doesn't mean that you are just like a passive doormat. I think it's proactive what he's telling them. What he's telling them to do is be proactive in it. And I think being radical and being so extreme as to offer the cheek or offer your shirt is a proactive way to stop that cycle and expose people in what they're doing. So I think the next part, verses 32 to 38, really show why we're able to do that. So in verse 32, it says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. So the original word credit is actually charis, which means grace. And it's not clear if you really look at the original language, if grace is the object or grace is the subject. And I think it could be read where grace is just, where it could be read like this: if you love those who love you, what is grace to you? And I think what that's saying is, if you are someone that has been, touched by God's grace, and you are someone that has received God's grace, then you should be able to give that grace to others. And I think it's a radical way of looking at the world, because I think oftentimes when people wrong us, when people do wrong to us, we always think that we're the victim, or we always think, man, why do I always get the short end of the stick? How come people are always doing this to me? And you kind of, see the world as being against you. But when you see, through Christ, that you have also done wrong and you're not perfect, and God has unconditionally forgiven you and accepted you just as you are, it's no longer you versus the world. It's you being a child of God, someone who is loved, someone who's been given much love. And as a result of that, you can't hold over all these things, against someone else when something bad happens. Because if you yourself see yourself as someone who has been consistently loved and forgiven, we are able to love and forgive others. And I think that's why in this section, Jesus really focuses on giving without expecting anything in return, loving not just those who love you back, but loving everybody. And I think we can only do that when we see ourselves as someone that is loved, right? If we can understand who we are in relation to Christ and who we are in relation to God, it's much more possible to give without expecting something back. It's much more possible to love people that is very hard to love with God in the picture. I would say it's very hard to do outside of that. But the focus really becomes, after this whole sermon, the focus, I think, is really on who are you, right? And that's why I the last sermon I called it Mirror Mirror, because I think this is a very hard sermon to preach on. I think it's a very hard passage to accept. But as I'm reading it, I really feel like I have to examine, who am I? Do I understand myself as someone that is loved? Do I understand myself as someone who is broken, but has been consistently forgiven and accepted just as I am, despite my flaws, despite, the things that I've done wrong? And if I can understand myself as that, then how I live, that can change how I live. That can change how I interact with the world. So that's something that I was really thinking a lot about during this passage.